Hi, I'm Joe Holman, practice leader for the newly minted ESG advisory group at Withum. My role at Withum is to help clients use ESG to drive value and not just be something that they talk about at the dinner table. Today, I'm going to quickly go through how ESG helps organizations find that value using ESG factors. So, ESG means many things to many people, but it depends on really the stakeholder that you're speaking to. So for investors, it's about financial drivers and results from ESG factors. For employees, it's about how ESG affects their employment. Communities, it's how the operations and activities of a company affect the community at large. So depending on the stakeholder, it depends on how ESG is viewed by the individual. So it's really important to understand who you're speaking to and who's speaking to you about ESG to get an idea of what's really motivating them. Today, I'm going to focus on companies, and so that would be the investor, owner, stakeholder. So for companies, ESG is the use of non-financial data points to create value and mitigate risk. So you create value by increasing your revenues, by making your product more attractive, decrease costs by being more environmentally efficient. Employee turnover, you address with DEE policies. DEE stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's a great way to help your recruiting and retention rates. And obviously, energy costs money, so to the extent you can reduce energy, you'll increase your operating efficiencies as well as help the environment. And from a mitigation standpoint for risk, improperly disposing of waste increases your liabilities and lender liabilities, which could affect your ability to get loans. Physical risks from climate change, we'll get into later on, but just think about if your properties get blown away because of flood, storm, fire, you lose your property. If you didn't mitigate the risks from those types of things, you lost your operations. Product quality can certainly affect your reputational risk. If you put out products that get recalled, that create sickness in the community, people will stop using your products or going to your restaurants. So it's things that like that matter, and those are all ESG factors. Supply chain risk, human rights violations. We saw that a number of retail clothing manufacturers were using slave labor to create their products, or at least paying people $1 a day. It created bad will in the industry. They had to go out and correct that. Weather affecting your supply chain, political risk. We saw with the China under Trump, where we put significant amount of tariffs on goods coming out of China. And now today with COVID, many things that you want in a restaurant or many things you want in a supermarket, they're just not available because they can't come in through the LA ports. And breach of personal information obviously is a problem ongoing in this world, where companies need to have strong cyber policies to prevent that personal information from getting out there. And with not doing that, it'll have financial implications in terms of making good for those people whose identities may have been stolen, as well as governmental fines, which can be substantial. I want to point out something I thought was a really interesting correlation. If you notice in the 1990s, there's something CSR, it means corporate social responsibility, and it's a way a company goes out and tells the world about their social responsibility activities. In 1990s, few companies were doing it, and then starting in around 2005 or so, the amount of companies were doubling year over year until today, where almost all companies, large companies that is, are reporting out on their social activities. And you can see how it parallels social media's influence in the marketplace, where these companies are really playing out to the social media world, to their customer base. As Facebook, Instagram, Twitter all became widely accepted and widely broadcasting companies' activities, companies began using those platforms to report their corporate social responsibility activities. So you can see that correlation there. But it's funny to note that investors don't view that information as very useful. Only 29% of investors thought those reports were useful, and that goes back to stakeholders. These reports are geared towards the consumer as opposed to helping the investor. Now we move on to the investors and how does investors use ESG? So there's 4 primary ESG strategies that companies should consider or investors consider. You have impact investing, which is where you make a measurable impact and your success is based upon that impact, not the financial return. So your impact could be building hospitals, building low-income housing, building highways, or mass transit. All of that has an impact to the community, not necessarily the best financial return. You have thematic investing, where you invest in the ESG sector. Almost always these sectors are green sectors. So you're investing in wind energy or solar energy or renewable energy, something like that. And those are green funds typically. Screening is what you mostly hear about on the news, and that's what you're like probably the advertising is the ETFs that you hear about. So you have these ESG ETFs. A lot of them have, around no oil and gas in the ETF, or no, they respect animal rights, things like that. And you'll see a lot of that marked as social responsible ETFs. But be careful, buyer be warned, I would say. If you look at the content of a lot of those ETFs, many of them are made up of fintech stocks, Microsoft, Amazon, Google. So, a lot of that stuff says they're social responsible, but in fact, they're just fintech, and you're paying a lot of basis points for that. The most commonly used ESG strategy is ESG integration, and that's really what's used by active investors. So that's the method where they use non-financial information to identify sources of risk and long-term opportunity. And that's really important to know, because it's not necessarily what's talked and thought about from ESG, but that's why 90% of the institutions use ESG integration when they say they have ESG strategies. And to give you an idea of the adoption of ESG in the investor community, there's a group called PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a UN spin out in 2006. You can see very few asset owners were part of it. And the purpose of ESG for investors was to use the capital markets to drive social change. So in 2006, you had a few investors adopting the principles of PRI. And then in 2015, you could see the numbers have been quite substantial. And in 2020, it doubled from 2015, the number of investors adopting the 6 principles of PRI, which are adopting or integrating ESG into the investment process. And a whopping $100 trillion of assets today are being managed in this way. So that's a lot of money. And to get up to those numbers, you can see how BlackRock has $6 or $7 trillion of assets under management, of which those assets are being managed using ESG principles. So a lot of the big asset owners do that, and they push it down to the investment managers, who they require to also do that. And that's why you see a lot more ESG being considered in the private equity world, the value world, and these questions are going out to a lot more of the operating companies. The SEC is also getting into the act. The SEC, as you see in 2020, post-Trump, is now acknowledging climate change, the importance of ESG reporting, transparency in the financial reports. So there's been a lot of action going on around that, and we think in 2022 you're going to start seeing reporting required in 10Ks and 10Qs and other regulatory reports to the SEC. And then I want to show you just some of the various frameworks and platforms that are out there that really add to a lot of the confusion of ESG. You have these rating agencies. I listed a dozen or so, but there's hundreds of them, and they're out there always putting out articles about ESG and how ESG investment helps the world, and they'll have a lot of examples of how their product made a difference in the world of investing for ESG. But you also have these frameworks out there. At Withum, we're here to help guide you through those frameworks, which one's most appropriate for you, SASB or GRI or GIN or the other two. I mean, it depends on your facts or circumstances and what your end goals are and who your stakeholders are. Signatories and certifiers, I've got 6 here. There's probably 60 in total. Again, we'll navigate you through which one's most relevant for you. Probably for the investors, you're looking at PRI and TCFD. Other people will look at some of the others. So here's kind of gets to the meat of what I wanted to get into, is I wanted to show some distinction between ESG objectives And this is where, again, we're always on the operating company side of the world. So we have operating companies, investment managers. The operating companies have a view of ESG where when they think about it, they're thinking about what are the needs of all the stakeholders. They really do think about, the community that they operate in, who's affected by their operations. They're thinking of their employees, DEI, and whatnot. So that's the intent of what they're doing. They try to use ESG to improve their operations by identifying key ESG value drivers. So they're very active in terms of using these non-financial ESG factors to help drive value by improving their operations. And they're trying to mitigate risks, again, looking at ESG factors to identify sources of risk and then mitigating those risks. And then they'll promote their ESG practices to their customers and the community at large. You shouldn't keep that type of information a secret. You should tell the world of what good you're doing. And you can see that the large corporations are doing that through their CSR reporting. And probably it's good for them, it's good for you. And as I point down, most large corporations do that. On the investment side, it's a completely different take on what's going on. They're purely thinking of the financial stakeholders, and they're only looking at sources of risk and long-term value. So they're very much like, where's the risk, where's the long-term value, and they're analyzing the company in that sense, whereas the company is actually taking direct action in terms of creating that value. They also want to address climate change and diversity within their portfolio companies. The reason why they focus on this is because their investors are very interested in climate change and diversity. So their investors are forcing on them to consider those two elements when they make investments in companies. So therefore, they consider that when they look at an operating company, whether it's material or not. They want to know what the portfolio company thinks about climate change and diversity. They also base their reporting purely on the SASB, which is Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, PRI, what we talked about, and TCFD, which we'll mention later on, that's related to climate change reporting. And then they also do it to meet regulatory requirements. So the investment manager is going to have certain questions, which they have to provide, say, to the EU regulators under an acronym SFDR. And there's others out there and other regulators, and probably next year will be the SEC. So to get into how an owner will do an ESG assessment or consider ESG, they have ESG factors and then a strategy to address those factors. Starting at the bottom, you have supply chain and food sourcing. So the restaurant, and I chose restaurants because we all know restaurants, so we can all probably relate to how these affect our experience at a restaurant. So you want to have, as an owner of a restaurant, consider food availability during certain periods of the year. So not all food is available at all time, and your ability to access that food, you should plan your menus accordingly. And then source as much product as you can locally to avoid disruptions in the food chain. The more food you source locally, the better it is for the local communities, as well as the less likelihood of having disruptions in your local food chain. I've been to restaurants now where I order steak and they don't have half the steaks on the menu. Or I've been to Starbucks, they don't have green tea. Or you go to these other stores and they're completely sold out of various products because they're sitting in the LA harbor. All of those are supply chain risk, and those are factors that should be thought of. Labor practices, fair wages, benefits for all employees, very important in terms of retention and attracting staff. Training, giving people an opportunity to advance is a great way to retain staff, or certainly hardworking staff that you want. Safe work environments, prevent lawsuits and other issues, and always make sure to implement a diversity, equity, inclusion type program. It really does make a difference. It's an easy way to improve your recruitment and retention rates, as well as the experience of your employees. So by having a diverse workforce, your employees will be happier and you'll be happier. Food safety, nutritional content, both of them, think about it. Food quality program is important, and factoring in risk on different types of food. Back to Chipotle. Chipotle had a bunch of E. coli cases a few years ago, and the E. coli cases really were sourced to the fact that Chipotle uses organic produce when creating their food products. Organic produce has twice the propensity of having E. coli, because when they grow organic foods, they use a lot more manure, so you have to be better at cleansing that food to prevent that manure from getting into the cooked foods to the customers. And they didn't have a program that addressed that risk profile. Therefore, they had a lot of E. coli cases, which effectively brought their stock price down by 50%. It has risen since then, but I know a lot of people are tentative about going back to eat Chipotle. Sorry, Chipotle on that. Provide nutritional and nutritional food choices, which is also really important. There's a number of people, they don't want to go to certain restaurants because there are no nutritional food choices, and people like to have the information as to what's nutritional, what's the calorie count. And I don't want to only have fried food. So if I have an alternative, I'll go to that type of restaurant. So it increases your client base. Again, affects revenue, but it also is healthy for the community at large. And lastly, you want to consider energy, water, and food packaging. All of those cost money. So to the extent that you use less energy, you will reduce your GHG emissions, which then helps the economy or helps the environment, and it will also help your own P&L by spending less money in energy. The same with water, not using, giving away plastic utensils. You've bought those utensils, you give them to customers that take them away and throw them away. Ultimately, that's a waste of money. To the extent you can't, you don't have to do things like that in terms of packaging, whatnot. Again, money saved. It goes to the bottom line. And lastly, distributing food to local food banks. Food at the end of the day that's able to be distributed to local food banks would go into the garbage. You have to pay a fee to have that garbage taken away. To the extent that you can give it to the local food bank, you're helping the local community. You get a lot of points from your local community by supporting people with malnourished people or homeless people or people that don't have access to food. And you're also supporting your bank account because you're not spending money to get rid of that garbage. And your investors would actually love you for that. So let's move on to investors. So how do investors look at the restaurant in terms of using ESG factors? Well, they're much more binary. It's, does somebody have an energy policy to manage their energy? Do they have food safety program? Do they have types of menu option, healthy menu options? And they look at what's the percentage of it. They want to know what's your GHG emission intensity by revenue. The reason why they look at intensity revenue by revenue is because it normalizes it across various other restaurants that they may be looking at. They want to know, say, percentage of renewable energy. As I mentioned before, their investors want them to reduce their climate, address climate change by reducing emission portfolio in the portfolios. So renewable energy is a simple way to do that. And then water restricted areas cause, what happens if you have water rationing? How does that affect operations? How does that affect P&L? Back to labor practices, voluntary, involuntary rates, average hourly rates, and percentage of employees earning minimum wage, all are indicators of what's going to happen or what's going on within your labor practices. And I guess obviously lawsuits, labor violations, and employment discrimination fines, all of that also are indicators of what's happening within your labor practices and can be red flags for problems. And lastly, back to sourcing. What percentage of your food is sourced locally? They're looking at supply chain risk, sources of critical food ingredients. Again, they're saying certain food that you really need to have, like the steak restaurant, you can't get it. That could be a problem that hurts your revenue. And I just brought this slide up here comparing the two. I'm not going to go through it all because we've seen it, but it's interesting to see, one side is action, the other side is just evaluating what the owner's doing. So one is saying, I'm taking action to improve, and then the investor says, well, are they considering ESG in their process? And if so, how? No discussion on ESG is complete without just talking about climate change. Climate change comes about when greenhouse gas levels rise in the atmosphere, resulting in greater atmospheric energy. The result is an increase in the average global temperature, which changes weather patterns. Higher temperatures result in a rise in sea level, changes in precipitation patterns, and an increase in storm intensity. More energy, stronger storms is what happens. And accept or deny climate change, investors and owners and governments are pushing for a reduction in carbon emissions, which means companies will have to reduce carbon emissions and operate in a low carbon economy. Remember, capital is king, so what capital says, capital does. And as you can see from the slide, investors and governments have pressured 1/5 of the world's 2,000 largest companies to commit to net zero. And this pressure is going to continue for smaller and smaller companies. Suppliers, on the other hand, are also pressuring their supply chain to reduce their carbon emissions. And you can see an example of Walmart that had a project gigaton, which is to reduce carbon emissions by 1 billion metric tons by 2030. Now, TCFD is how you measure carbon or climate change. TCFD was provided companies a way to report climate change risk and carbon emissions. The SEC is also looking at adopting a TCFD principle sometime in 2022. So TCFD looks at the risks and then measuring emissions. So the risks are physical risks, transitional risks, and regulatory risks. So physical risks is destruction of your operations property plant from extreme weather events such as storms, hurricanes, flooding, drought. So those are things that disrupt your operations, and they're very important to understand what they're going to be and mitigate those risks. Transitional risks are really a change of the economy to a low emissions economy. So you'll see that consumer preferences may prefer a low carbon economy. Investors are pushing you to a low carbon economy. All of that is transitional risk. Regulatory risk, on the other hand, is a change in government policy, and it usually revolves around carbon tax, because governments love taxes, and you'll see more and more of that going forward. In fact, New York City is instituting a carbon tax in 2 years from now on properties greater than 25,000 square feet. And then the last part of TCFD is just reporting on what your emissions are and emissions reduction targets. Now, what those emissions are, that's disputable. There's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, which we'll talk about in a moment, but there's a lot of controversy as to what emissions should be reported and what you consider emissions are from a company. Now, climate-related risks by industry is this was put out by SASB, where they show 77 different industries and how those industries are affected by physical risk, transitional risk, and regulatory risk. Not going through it, but you can see how dark is risk, light is no risk. You can see most industries are affected by transitional risk of the governments and investors requiring companies to go to or move to a lower emissions economy. And the physical risk, a lot of industries are affected by storms, floodings, droughts, fires. So this is a graph they put together to help companies identify which risks they're susceptible to. Last thing I want to talk about is what emissions are. So there's 3 types of emissions to know about. You have direct emissions, which is scope 1, and direct emissions result from emissions that occur on your physical plant or at your facilities. So gas, oil, if you have company cars, the gas that goes into that car, because the car is considered company property, those are all examples of direct emissions. Indirect emissions is primarily electricity. Think about it, you use electricity at your facilities, your office, but the actual emissions occur where the electricity is being generated. That's why it's considered indirect emissions. Steam in New York City is also considered indirect emissions. And then you have scope 3, and this is where things get fuzzy. So you have your upstream and downstream activities. So think of a clothing manufacturer where their upstream activities is growing, say cotton, picking the cotton, transporting the cotton to the facility to create the clothing. All of that could be considered scope 3. Then it comes to the company's plant. The plant processes that clothing, puts it in packaging, and then ships it to the stores to buy, for consumers to buy that clothing. That would be your downstream activity. And then the shipping costs to go, or the shipping emissions to go to that plant, also all of it add to emissions and ultimately when that clothing is thrown away is part of that scope 3 downstream emissions. So you can see how it's very difficult to measure. What are those boundaries? And those are part of the controversy of emissions and measurements. All right. For today, I want to leave everybody with two thoughts. I want people to think about what is my ESG profile, and I want people to think about what is my carbon footprint. And I don't want you to be that ostrich like we see in the picture of hiding their head in the sand. Thank you, and please, any questions you may have.